She had stopped feeling her feet a long time ago. That was how Emily Carter knew she was running out of time. The snow kept falling harder, thick and quiet, covering her tracks as if the world itself wanted to erase her. Each breath burned her chest, sharp and shallow, and her fingers were so stiff she could not curl them anymore. Christmas Eve had come to Wyoming with no mercy that year. The wind cut through her thin dress like a blade, soaking it until the fabric froze against her skin. If she closed her eyes again, she knew she would not open them. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Behind her, lights glowed faintly from the saloon on the edge of Cheyenne. That place still smelled like smoke and whiskey in her memory. Caleb Turner's voice echoed in her head, low and sure, the way it always sounded when he reminded her that she belonged to him. He had grabbed her arm as she tried to leave earlier that night, fingers digging hard enough to leave bruises. He said she owed him, said she would never make it on her own, said the cold would teach her a lesson. She had run anyway. Emily stumbled across the open field, every step slower than the last. Her legs barely obeyed her. Snow crept up the hem of her dress, numbing her knees, then her thighs. Her breath came out in broken clouds, her vision darkening at the edges. The night felt alive, watching her, waiting. Not here, she begged silently. Not like this. Her knees gave out without warning. She fell forward into the snow, her cheek pressed against ice, so cold it almost felt soft. The fear faded first, then the pain. A strange calm settled over her, heavy and gentle. Maybe this was how it ended. At least Caleb would never own her again. Then she heard it. Hooves. Slow at first, then closer. The sound cut through the wind like a promise she didn't trust. Boots crunched through the snow. A voice followed, rough and urgent. Miss, can you hear me? Strong arms lifted her from the ground. Her body felt light, like it didn't belong to her anymore. She caught the faint smell of leather and wood smoke, something warm and real. A heavy coat wrapped around her shoulders, and she was pulled against a chest that radiated heat. She forced her eyes open for 1 second. A man looked down at her, his face lined by years of sun and hard work. His beard was dusted with snow, his eyes dark with worry. John Miller, the rancher who lived alone near the Powder River. People in town said he was cold, distant, a man who didn't need anyone. Right then, he looked terrified of losing her. Stay awake, he said, his voice tight. Please stay with me. Her lips barely moved. Don't let me die. I won't, he said, holding her tighter. Not tonight. The storm roared around them as he carried her to his cabin. Firelight flickered against the log walls when he pushed the door open. He laid her on the bed, hands steady even though his jaw was clenched. Her body shook so hard the blankets moved with every breath. John pressed a warm cloth into her hands, rubbing gently, waiting for any sign she was still there. Her skin barely reacted, and the sight scared him more than he wanted to admit. Emily looked up at him through heavy lids. If I fall asleep, she whispered, will I wake up again? He didn't answer. He just kept his hand over hers, refusing to let go, as if his grip alone could keep her alive. And for the first time in years, Emily felt something she had almost forgotten existed. She felt safe. She didn't know yet that this night, the night she nearly froze to death on Christmas Eve, was only the beginning. She didn't know she would soon have to ask this quiet rancher for something far more dangerous than shelter. A place to stay, and eventually a place in his life. When Emily opened her eyes the next morning, warmth surrounded her. For one confused second, she thought she had died and woken somewhere peaceful. Then she saw the cabin walls, the fire still glowing, and John standing at the stove, stirring a pot like it was part of his daily routine. You're awake, he said, relief hidden under calm. Good. Eat before you pass out again. Her hands shook as she reached for the bowl, holding it like it was the most valuable thing she had ever owned. And as she swallowed the first warm sip, one truth settled deep in her chest. If she went back to town, she would lose her life. If she stayed here, everything would change. The warmth didn't feel real at first. Emily lay still, afraid that if she moved, it would disappear. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt. Her fingers burned like fire had been poured into them, and every breath pulled tight across her ribs. But she was alive, fully alive. That thought alone made her throat tighten. John moved around the small cabin without much noise, like a man used to being alone. He kept glancing over at her, pretending he wasn't. When he handed her the bowl again, his fingers brushed hers by accident. He pulled back fast, like he'd crossed a line. "Take it slow," he said. "Your body's still catching up." She nodded and drank carefully. The broth warmed her from the inside out, and before she could stop herself, her eyes filled. She turned her face away, embarrassed by the tears. John noticed anyway. He always did. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's coming after you." The words cracked something open inside her. Safe. No one had said that to her in years. She wanted to believe him, but belief had a way of getting her hurt. She stayed in bed most of that day. John kept the fire going and checked on her more than he admitted. When she slept, it wasn't the empty kind of sleep she was used to. It was heavy, deep, filled with warmth instead of fear. She woke once to the sound of wood being carved. John sat near the window, shaping a small piece of pine with a knife, his movements slow and steady. Not restless, just patient. "You don't have to watch me," she murmured. "I know," he said. "Just easier this way." That night, when the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked, Emily woke gasping. Her heart raced like she was back in the snow again. Before she could stop herself, she whispered his name. John was on his feet instantly. He didn't touch her at first, just stood close enough that she could feel his presence. "You're not there anymore," he said gently. "You're here." She nodded, breathing through the panic until it faded. After that, sleep came easier. The next few days passed quietly. Her hands stayed wrapped in cloth, and John made sure she ate even when she said she wasn't hungry. He never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. That meant more to her than she could explain. By the fourth morning, she managed to stand on her own without shaking. Outside, the world looked different. The storm had softened the land, covering everything in white. The ranch stretched wide and still, honest in a way Cheyenne never felt. She stood on the porch, holding a small basket John had given her, breathing in cold air that didn't scare her anymore. "Thank you," she said softly. John nodded once. "You're welcome." She knew she couldn't leave yet, and he knew it too. That afternoon, she finally said it out loud. "If I go back, he'll take me again." John didn't pretend not to understand. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. "You can stay," he said after a moment. "For now, help where you can. No debt, no strings." Hope stirred, small but real. But peace never lasted long in her life. 3 days later, she saw the rider. Her hands went numb as she watched the horse come closer. The way the man sat, the angle of his hat, she knew it before she saw his face. Caleb Turner. John was fixing a fence when the rider stopped near the barn. Emily stepped outside with a basket, then froze. Caleb smiled like he already owned the ending. "Emily," he said smoothly. "There you are." Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. "I didn't run off with anyone." John stepped between them. "She doesn't owe you a thing." Caleb laughed, but his eyes stayed hard. "That's not how I remember it." When Caleb grabbed her wrist, pain shot up her arm. She cried out. John moved faster than she thought possible. One shove, one clean punch. Caleb hit the snow hard. "Touch her again," John said calmly, "and you won't leave this ranch." Caleb rode away furious, promising trouble. Emily sat shaking on the porch steps. John knelt beside her. "You're safe here," he said again. This time, she believed him. Silence followed after Caleb rode off, the kind that felt heavier than shouting. Emily stayed on the porch long after John went back to his work, her wrist aching, her heart still racing. She kept replaying the moment in her head. The way John had stepped in front of her without hesitation, the way his voice never rose even when violence hung in the air. No one had ever done that for her. Not once. That night, she barely touched her food. John noticed. "You don't have to pretend you're fine," he said, setting his cup down. She hesitated, then spoke softly. "He won't stop. Men like him never do." John leaned back in his chair, eyes on the fire. "I know. The honesty in his voice scared her more than empty comfort would have. She wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the warmth steady her. I don't want to bring trouble into your life. He looked at her then, really looked. Trouble finds people whether they invite it or not. The next morning passed like any other, but the air felt different. John worked with his rifle closer than usual. Emily cleaned, cooked, tried to make herself useful, but her nerves stayed tight. She jumped at every sound outside. Late in the afternoon, shadows moved along the tree line. Her chest tightened. She knew that shape of danger now. Hooves followed. 2 riders approached the cabin slow and deliberate. John stepped onto the porch with his rifle in hand. One of the men wore a deputy badge that didn't sit right. The other was Caleb, smiling like he'd already won. The deputy unfolded a paper. "We're here about a debt," he said, not meeting Emily's eyes. "So she belongs back in town." Emily felt something shift inside her. Fear, yes, but also anger. She stepped forward before John could speak. "That paper's a lie," she said clearly. "You know it is." The deputy hesitated. His eyes flicked to John, then back to Caleb. Everyone in the county knew John Miller's reputation, knew he didn't bluff. Slowly, the deputy lowered the paper. "I'm not touching this." Caleb's smile vanished. "Coward." John stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "She's not leaving. Not today. Not ever by your hand." Caleb looked like he might explode, but he knew when he was beaten. He rode away again, hatred trailing behind him like smoke. That night, the cabin felt warmer than usual. Emily sat beside John by the fire, watching the flames dance. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You already have," he replied. In the days that followed, life settled into a rhythm. Emily helped care for a sick calf. She brought John tea when his back hurt. They spoke in quiet moments, laughter slipping in where fear used to live. But something else grew between them too, something neither of them said out loud. One night, unable to sleep, Emily stood by the fire, staring at the man who had changed her life. John lay on the bed, boots off, eyes closed, looking tired in a way only years could cause. She knew then she was done running. She walked to him, her hands trembling, her heart steady. "John," she said softly. He opened his eyes. "I'm done being afraid," she whispered. "I don't want to leave this life." He swallowed. "You deserve someone better." She shook her head. "I want the man who carried me out of the snow." Silence stretched between them. "If I say yes," he said finally, "everything changes." She smiled through tears. "Then let it change." And in that quiet cabin, 2 wounded souls chose each other, not out of need, but out of courage. The cabin felt too quiet after that, like the walls themselves were listening. Emily sat by the fire long after the flames had settled into a slow, steady burn. John lay awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his hands folded over his chest. Neither of them slept. Not really. It wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of things unsaid. Emily broke the silence first. "I didn't plan to stay alive," she admitted quietly. "That night in the snow, I thought I was done." John turned his head toward her. "I'm glad you were wrong." She gave a small, sad smile. "So am I. But now that I'm here, I don't know how to live without looking over my shoulder." John sat up slowly, joints stiff, honesty written all over his face. "I won't lie to you. The world out there doesn't stop being cruel just because you found one safe place. But while you're here, you won't face it alone." Her eyes filled again, but this time she didn't turn away. "No one's ever said that to me before." He nodded once. "That's their failing, not yours." The days that followed were quieter, but deeper. Emily learned the rhythm of the ranch. The early mornings, the cold air biting her lungs, the way John moved with purpose even when his back ached. He showed her how to feed the horses, how to spot a loose fence line before it became a problem. She cooked meals that slowly stopped tasting like survival and started tasting like home. They talked in pieces at first, small truths, safe ones. Then one evening, while she washed dishes and he dried them, Emily spoke without looking up. "Caleb never hit me where people could see." John's hand stilled. He didn't interrupt. "He used words more than fists," she continued. "Told me I was lucky he wanted me. Told me no one else would." John set the plate down carefully. He was wrong. She finally looked at him. I know that now, but it took almost dying to see it. That night, when the wind rattled the windows, Emily woke shaking. John didn't wait for her to call out. He sat beside her, resting a steady hand on the edge of the bed. You're here, he reminded her softly. You're safe. She reached out and held his hand without thinking. He didn't pull away. Something changed after that. Not all at once. Slowly, naturally, they began to sit closer, linger longer in shared silence. When John laughed, really laughed, it surprised them both. When Emily smiled, it reached her eyes now, but fear hadn't left completely. One afternoon, Emily found John standing by the fence, staring toward the trail. His jaw was tight. He won't stop, will he? She asked. No, John said honestly, but that doesn't mean he wins. That night, Emily made her decision. She stood by the fire, watching John read by lamplight. The lines on his face told stories of loss, of endurance, of a man who had learned to survive alone. She realized something then. He hadn't saved her because he was strong. He'd saved her because he was kind. She walked to him slowly, heart pounding. I don't want to be a guest here anymore. John looked up, concern flashing in his eyes. Emily, I'm not asking out of fear, she said quickly. I'm asking because this life matters to me. Because you matter to me. He stood, towering and unsure all at once. I'm not young. I'm not easy. And I don't promise comfort. She stepped closer. I don't need perfect. I need real. He searched her face, looking for doubt. He didn't find it. If we do this, he said quietly, it's forever. She nodded. That's the point. John exhaled slowly, like a man finally setting down a burden. Then stay. As my wife. Emily's breath caught. Tears fell freely now. Yes, she whispered. I choose this. Outside, the winter night pressed against the cabin, cold and unforgiving. Inside, two people who had been broken in different ways chose warmth. Not because it was easy, but because it was brave. The morning after that choice felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just steadier. Emily woke before the sun, listening to the quiet crackle of dying embers in the hearth and the slow, even breathing of John asleep nearby. For years, mornings had meant dread for her, another day of being told what she was worth. This one felt like something else. Possibility. She moved carefully, not wanting to wake him, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the land lay still under a thin sheet of snow, the sky pale and waiting. She stepped onto the porch and let the cold air fill her lungs. It no longer felt like an enemy. When John joined her a few minutes later, pulling on his coat, she smiled without thinking. He noticed. You look lighter, he said. I feel lighter, she replied. Then, after a pause, and terrified, he chuckled softly. That means it matters. They didn't tell anyone right away. There was no rush, no need for an announcement. Their days stayed simple, work, meals, quiet evenings. But everything beneath the surface had shifted. When John reached for her hand, it wasn't hesitant anymore. When Emily spoke, she didn't measure every word. Still, the past had a way of knocking without warning. A week later, a neighbor rode up with supplies. He lingered longer than usual, eyes curious. Heard some talk in town, he said carefully, about a woman and trouble. Emily stiffened, but John answered calmly. Talk's cheap. After the man left, Emily's old fear crept back in. What if the town turns against us? John met her gaze. Then we stand anyway. That night, she confessed something she'd never said out loud. I'm afraid I'll ruin this, that I'll bring chaos into your quiet life. John took her hands, rough and warm. This life was quiet because it was empty. You didn't ruin anything. You filled it. Her chest tightened at that. As winter deepened, they worked side by side. Emily learned the weight of responsibility, the ache of honest labor. She learned that John wasn't distant. He was careful with his heart. And John learned that Emily was stronger than her past ever allowed her to believe. They planned their wedding with no fuss. No guests beyond a local preacher and one neighbor who owed John a favor. Emily wore a simple dress she had mended herself. John wore his cleanest shirt, hands trembling more than he expected as he took hers. I promise to protect, he said. I promise to stay, she answered. That night, as they sat by the fire, Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret opening the door that night?" John smiled faintly. "Every hard road I walked led to that moment. The world outside didn't change. Trouble still existed. The cold still came. But inside that cabin, something stronger had taken root. And Emily understood the truth she would carry forever. Sometimes survival is not enough. Sometimes you have to choose to live." Winter settled in deeper after that, the kind that pressed down on the land and tested everything that tried to stand against it. Emily learned quickly that love didn't erase fear. It lived beside it. Some mornings she woke with a tight chest, half expecting to hear Caleb's voice outside the door or feel that old panic crawl back into her bones. On those days, John noticed without her saying a word. He never asked, "What's wrong?" He just said, "Coffee's hot," or "Give me a hand with the horses." And somehow, that helped more than questions ever could. They worked side by side through the cold. Emily's hands grew rough, her muscles sore in ways she'd never known. But there was pride in it now. Honest work made her feel solid, real, not owned, not trapped. John showed her how to read the sky, how to tell when snow would turn dangerous, how to calm a nervous horse with nothing but a steady voice. One evening, after a long day mending a fence line, Emily finally spoke the thought that had been sitting heavy in her chest. "Do you ever think I'll wake up one day and realize this was all borrowed?" John stopped what he was doing. "Borrow? That safety doesn't belong to me," she said quietly. "But I'll be asked to give it back." He walked closer, his boots slow on the wooden floor. "Emily, nothing real is borrowed. It's built, and we're building this together." She nodded, though part of her still struggled to believe it. Trouble didn't announce itself when it returned. It never did. It arrived in small signs. A fence cut clean instead of broken by weather. Tracks near the creek that didn't belong to any neighbor. A feeling John got in his gut that made him keep his rifle closer. One night, Emily found him sitting awake by the fire, staring into the flames. "You're thinking about him," she said. John didn't deny it. Men like Caleb don't let go of what they think is theirs. She sat beside him. "I'm not afraid of him the way I was." That surprised him. "Why not?" "Because I know who I am now," she said. "And I know I'm not alone." A few days later, the confirmation came. A message passed through town. Caleb had been drinking again, talking loud, making promises. Emily heard it secondhand, but still made her stomach drop. "I won't run," she told John firmly. "Not this time." He studied her face, searching for doubt. Finding none. "Then neither will I." The night Caleb finally came back, the wind was calm. Too calm. Emily sensed it before she saw him. A single rider stopped just beyond the fence, staying in the shadows. John stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "You've said your piece already." Caleb laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think a ring changes anything? She still owes me." Emily stepped forward beside John. Her voice didn't shake. "I don't know you my fear anymore." For a moment, the world held its breath. Caleb saw it then, the truth. She was no longer someone he could bend. He spat into the dirt and rode off, defeated not by force, but by certainty. Emily let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her knees trembled, but she didn't fall. John turned to her, pride softening his eyes. "You stood your ground." "So did you," she said. That night, wrapped in warmth, Emily understood something important. Being saved had kept her alive, but standing for herself had finally made her free. After that night, something inside Emily finally settled. Not the kind of peace that made life easy, but the kind that stayed even when fear knocked. She still woke sometimes before dawn, heart racing, reaching for the edge of the bed just to be sure John was there. Every time her fingers touched his sleeve or his hand, the panic loosened its grip. John noticed the change too. She walked straighter now, spoke without shrinking. When she laughed, it wasn't careful anymore. Life didn't slow down for their healing. The ranch demanded attention every day. Animals still got sick. Fences still broke. Winter still bit hard. But there was comfort in routine. Emily learned how to read John's silences, when to let him be and when to push a mug of hot coffee into his hands without a word. John learned when Emily needed space and when she needed him close, even if she didn't ask. One evening, as they sat at the table mending torn gloves, John spoke in a low voice. I should have done more that first day. Emily looked up. What do you mean? I should have gone into town, he said. Should have made sure he couldn't follow you. She shook her head gently. You gave me something more important than protection. You gave me a choice. That answer stayed with him. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. No threats, no demands, just news. Caleb had been arrested after starting a fight he couldn't talk his way out of. The deputy this time was real. The paper was official. Emily read the letter twice before handing it to John. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. It's over. John folded the paper carefully. It's done. She expected relief to rush in all at once. Instead, what came was quieter. A deep exhale, a release she hadn't realized she'd been holding back for years. That night, Emily cried for the girl she used to be, the one who thought survival was the same as living. John held her without trying to fix it, without telling her to be strong. He just stayed. Spring came slowly, as it always did. Snow melted into mud. The creek swelled. The land softened. With it, so did Emily's memories. They still existed, but they no longer controlled her steps. One afternoon, standing in the field with sunlight on her face, she realized she was smiling for no reason at all. John watched her from a distance, leaning on a fence post, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude, not just for love, but for timing. For the fact that two broken paths had crossed when they needed each other most. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Emily spoke softly. If you hadn't opened that door. John shook his head. Don't finish that. She nodded. I know. I just wanted you to know I would have knocked anyway. He smiled at that. They sat in silence, the good kind, knowing their story wasn't perfect or clean, but it was theirs, built slowly, honestly, with scars left visible, not hidden. The first summer they spent together didn't feel like a reward. It felt like proof. Proof that life could keep going after pain, that endings didn't always mean loss. Emily still carried her past with her, but no longer sat on her chest. It rested behind her, like a shadow that only appeared when the sun was right. Some evenings, she and John sat on the porch without speaking, watching the light fade across the land. He would sip his coffee slowly. She would lean against his shoulder. There was no rush to fill the silence. They had both lived long enough to know that quiet could be earned. One night, Emily broke that silence. Do you ever think about who you were before this? John thought for a moment. I think I was surviving. Same as you. She nodded. I thought surviving was all I was allowed to want. He turned to her then. It's what people tell you when they don't want you to expect more. Emily let that sink in. She had begged for shelter once. For warmth. For a place to rest. What she had found was something deeper. A place where she was seen, where her voice mattered, where love wasn't loud or cruel or controlling. It was steady, chosen, given freely. They never pretended their life was perfect. Some days were hard. Old fears surfaced without warning. John still carried regrets from years spent alone. Emily still had moments where she doubted her worth. But now, when those moments came, they faced them together. One afternoon, while helping a traveler whose wagon had broken down near the ranch, Emily realized something had changed inside her. She spoke with confidence. She set boundaries without fear. She offered kindness without losing herself. The woman she had once been would not have recognized her. That night, Emily said it out loud. I don't feel small anymore. John smiled, pride clear in his eyes. You never were. As the seasons turned, their story became less about what had nearly ended Emily's life and more about what saved it. Not the cold night, not the rescue, but the choices that followed. The courage to stay, the courage to trust, the courage to believe she deserved more than pain just because pain was familiar. Years later, when winter came again and the wind howled outside the cabin, Emily stood by the door and looked out at the snow. She thought about that girl who had collapsed in the cold, convinced the world wanted her gone. She whispered softly, You made it. John came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, steady and warm. You did, and that was the truth of it. Sometimes, life doesn't change because someone saves you. It changes because you finally choose to save yourself, and someone stands beside you while you do. Emily had learned that love was not something you begged for in the dark. It was something you stepped into fully when you believed you were worth the light. And that belief changed everything.